The cold wind cut into Charlotte's skin, making her shrink against the arms of the man carrying her. It was a dark and silent early morning, with the muffled sound of hurried footsteps echoing along the dirt path. She could barely understand what was happening. The last thing she remembered was the warmth of her mother's arms. Before she was ripped from her home, her life, and handed over to a stranger who was now leading her toward a dark future, far from everything she knew. The journey was long, but Charlotte's fear was even greater than her exhaustion. All that remained was the pain of separation and a sense of emptiness that would follow her for years. She had never understood why her mother had allowed it, but the woman's words still echoed in her mind. It's for your own good. They will give you a better life. When they finally arrived at their destination, Charlotte could barely see where she was. The house was large, imposing, a true castle in the middle of the countryside. The Davenports, a wealthy and respected family, were known for their generosity, but also for their secrets, something Charlotte didn't yet understand. The man who had brought her was greeted by a stern-looking butler who bowed and, without saying a word, led Charlotte down the mansion's halls. Each step she took within those cold walls made her heart race. She felt like an intruder, a piece out of place, and couldn't stop thinking about her mother, her life, which now seemed as distant as the stars. It was then that she saw her for the first time. Margaret Davenport, the matriarch of the house, a woman with an elegant posture and penetrating eyes. She looked at Charlotte with a gaze that mixed curiosity with a lightness Charlotte had never seen before. It wasn't like the look from the other adults, that look full of distrust. Margaret smiled comfortingly. "You're the girl, aren't you?" she said, her voice soft and welcoming. Charlotte didn't know how to respond, so she just nodded. "We'll give you a good home, dear. You'll be safe here." Those words felt like both a promise and a sentence. Charlotte didn't know it, but at that moment, her life was about to take a turn that would lead her somewhere far different from what she had ever imagined. The truth was that she wouldn't just be a servant. Margaret and her husband, Henry, had plans for her, plans she didn't yet understand. And those plans, like the secrets of the Davenport family, were about to change everything. Thomas, the eldest son of the couple, watched her from afar. He was the same age as Charlotte, and though he was polite and respectful, there was something in his gaze that made her uncomfortable, as if he already knew something she didn't. But what Charlotte couldn't foresee was that, over time, life in that strange family would make her lose control over everything she had always known to be right. Something would begin to grow between her and Thomas, something that defied morality, something that could destroy everything around them. But for now, all she knew was that this was the beginning of her new life, and the promises made by Margaret seemed to be the only thing she could trust, even though, deep down, something told her that there was a shadow in that house, a shadow she couldn't yet understand. Years passed more quickly than Charlotte expected. The Davenport mansion, with its tall gates and immaculate gardens, became her home. The smell of aged wood, the sound of footsteps in the corridor, and even the soft light that came through her bedroom window became part of the fabric of her new life. But despite the comfort, something always seemed out of place. Margaret, though a kind and affectionate woman, had a presence that made the house feel even more oppressive. Henry, the patriarch of the family, was a man who rarely showed emotion. His rigidity was a mark of his figure, a figure Charlotte never dared question but watched with curiosity. He had eyes that seemed to know more than they let on, eyes that rarely smiled. Then there was Thomas, the adopted brother who, over the years, became more than that. At first, he was just a young man like her. They spent a lot of time together, exploring the fields around the house, reading books on lazy afternoons, or just talking about trivial matters. He was the type of person you could talk to about anything, and Charlotte soon realized his presence was comfortable, even necessary. But as the years passed, the bond between them transformed. What was once a simple friendship began to carry attention Charlotte couldn't fully understand. He looked at her in a way that made her uncomfortable, but at the same time, his touch, his gaze, seemed protective, almost possessive. Thomas was growing, just like her. Their bodies had changed, and with that, their feelings had as well. It was strange, confusing, and more than anything, forbidden. Charlotte knew something was wrong with the way he looked at her, but she didn't know how to deal with it. She felt like she was in an invisible prison, a prison built on something she couldn't control. The fear of what was happening only grew as their moments alone together became more frequent. A lingering touch, a deeper conversation, a smile that lasted longer than necessary. Charlotte tried to push the thoughts away, convincing herself it was just the homesickness, the longing for a life she would never have again. But something inside her told her it was more than that. On an autumn afternoon, as they walked through the garden, Thomas suddenly stopped, his eyes fixed on hers with an intensity that made her hold her breath. "Charlotte," he began, his voice carrying something she couldn't identify. "Have you ever thought about what we are to each other?" Charlotte didn't know what to say. She felt the heat rise to her face, making her even more uncomfortable. It was as if he had seen something in her eyes that she was trying to hide. I don't know, Thomas. I don't know if it's something we should think about," but he moved closer, his body almost touching hers, and Charlotte felt a wave of heat flood her chest. A wave of conflicting emotions. There was something about him that drew her in, but also something that frightened her. "I think about it all the time, Charlotte," he whispered, "and I can't ignore it anymore." She took a step back, trying to find the words to deal with what was happening. The truth, however, was that the words were already getting lost in a whirlwind of emotions. What they felt wasn't right. They both knew that. What should have been a sibling love was turning into something deeper, more dangerous. And that made Charlotte spiral into doubts and fears. But at the same time, she couldn't push away the desire. Something between them was growing, and like a flame, it seemed impossible to control. The next day, Charlotte woke up with a strange feeling, as if the very air around her was dense and heavy with something she couldn't comprehend. That's when she knew something else was happening in the mansion. Something like her relationship with Thomas was about to be revealed, something that would forever change the way she saw the Davenports. Margaret was different. There was something in her eyes, a sadness Charlotte had never seen before. She watched her with an unsettling intensity, as if she knew something Charlotte didn't. That sense of discomfort grew every day, and as the days dragged on, the young girl began to realize that the truth was closer than she imagined. The Davenports' past was not as simple as she thought, and as her relationship with Thomas deepened, the family's secrets began to surface like a storm about to break. Charlotte felt the weight of it all. Every day, the memories of her mother and her past life seemed further away. She tried not to think about what could have been, about what her life should have been, and tried to fit into this new world, where the rules were different, where she didn't know what was right or wrong. The Davenport mansion, with its long corridors and dusty bookshelves, was becoming more of a maze of confused emotions. And in the midst of that maze, Thomas was the only certainty she had, but the relationship between them was changing in ways she couldn't control. In recent months, everything had become more intense, more urgent. During dinners, the glances between them became harder to ignore. Charlotte tried to distract herself with Margaret's conversations about how she should behave in society, or with Henry's concerns about the family business. But all the while, Thomas was there, with his calm smile, but with something else in his eyes, something that made her feel a lump in her throat. One night, while walking through the garden of the house, away from Margaret and Henry's curious gazes, Charlotte felt the tension in the air. The wind, which had once been fresh and comforting, now seemed heavy with the weight of what was about to happen. They were alone, and the silence between them was palpable. "Charlotte, what are we doing?" Thomas asked, his voice low but filled with something she couldn't identify. "I can't keep hiding it." She turned to him, trying to understand what he meant. "Hiding what, Thomas?" The doubt was clear in her voice, but inside, a sense of discomfort grew, as if she already knew exactly where that conversation was heading. "Everything. What I feel, what you feel too," he replied, with an intensity that almost made her tremble. Charlotte didn't know how to respond. She felt her heart race, but the words wouldn't come. How could she? How could she confess something that was wrong? Something she knew she shouldn't feel, but was there, latent all the time. Thomas, she began, her voice faltering. This can't happen. We're siblings, adopted siblings. The last word came out as a whisper, as if she herself didn't believe what she was saying. He took a step closer to her, his gaze fixed on hers. But we're not blood. Charlotte, you know that. I can't keep pushing away what I feel for you. Those words hung in the air, and Charlotte stood there, frozen, not knowing what to do with all of it. What he was saying wasn't something she could just ignore, as if it were a mistake made in a moment of weakness. It wasn't that. It was something deep, something that touched every fiber of her being, something she couldn't deny, but didn't know how to handle. The tension between them was growing, and though Charlotte tried to convince herself that this was just a phase, a passing confusion, she knew she was fooling herself. Their relationship was no longer the same. The affection she felt for him was turning into something more, something dangerous, something that could destroy everything around her. And the worst part, she didn't know how to get rid of it. But there was something else, something that, amidst all of this, couldn't be ignored. Margaret and Henry were hiding something. Charlotte could feel it in the air. She looked at her adoptive mother often and saw the sadness in her eyes, but she never dared to question her. Thomas seemed to sense it too, but never spoke of it. There was a heavy silence that hung over the house, a sense that something was about to be revealed, something that would change everything. One night, while the family gathered for dinner, Charlotte noticed something she never would have imagined. Henry, the patriarch of the house, was restless. Something rare for him. He radiated a kind of tension Charlotte had never seen before. Margaret's words were shorter, her eyes more closed, as if she wanted to hide something. The conversation felt forced, as if everyone was just waiting for the night to pass. That night, after everyone had retired, Charlotte decided to follow her instincts and explore the empty corridors of the mansion. She knew something was happening, something that involved her own origins. She already felt, deep inside, that the Davenport family was not what it seemed. The idea of being just an adopted girl was fading, and doubts began to surface with full force. That's when she found Margaret's diary, forgotten in a drawer. What was inside? She didn't know, but her curiosity won out. What she found made her blood run cold. Details of a hidden past, information that surprisingly connected her to Margaret and Henry's story. A name she could never have imagined. The name of her real father. Charlotte felt a chill run down her spine. She knew the pieces of the puzzle were starting to fall into place, but at the same time, the fear of what she might discover paralyzed her. But one thing was clear. Her story was far from simple. She was at the center of something much bigger, something no one there seemed willing to reveal. The night dragged on, and Charlotte could no longer shake the feeling that something was about to change. Margaret's journal was in her hands, the ink of the words staining her fingers as if the paper itself wanted to reveal the truth. Each sentence felt like a sharp blade cutting through the lies she had been forced to believe. But what troubled her most wasn't what was written on the pages, but what wasn't written. She spent hours reading, tearing through each word with a frantic care, until finally, when the first rays of sunlight began to pierce through the mansion's large stained glass windows, Charlotte stood up, dazed. What she had learned so far was just the tip of the iceberg. The name in Margaret's journal, the name of her biological father, all of it connected her directly to a much darker story than she had imagined. It was as if, finally, the veil had been lifted from her eyes. The truth about her adoption was not simply a story of charity or kindness. No, there was something much darker behind it all. What she didn't know was that the pieces of the puzzle were fitting together in a way that would turn her life upside down. The next morning, Charlotte sought out Thomas. He was in the garden, gazing at the empty field beyond the gates. The daylight seemed to intensify the tension between them, but it also brought a sense of urgency. Something needed to be said, Something needed to be faced. Charlotte's eyes met his, and in that moment, she knew the truth could no longer be ignored. Thomas, she began, her voice firmer than before, I know who my biological father is. He looked at her with cautious interest, as if he had been waiting for this. What do you know? His voice was calm, but his eyes were sharp, attentive. She looked at him, trying to organize her thoughts. He's alive, Thomas, and he was the one who sold me. He orchestrated all of this. Margaret and Henry didn't adopt me out of kindness. They did it because he hated them. He wanted to destroy their lives. The words hung in the air, heavy and crushing. Thomas was silent for a moment, his eyes wide, trying to process what she had just said. But Charlotte knew the truth was about to come crashing down on them. I know this sounds impossible, she continued, but what you don't understand is that he sold me to them as part of a plan for revenge. He wanted them to suffer, and in the end, he succeeded. Thomas stepped closer, his eyes now filled with a mix of shock and doubt. But why, Charlotte? Why would he do that? And why are you telling me this now? She looked at him, and everything she felt, everything she knew, condensed into a single sentence. Because he's the man responsible for the downfall of the Davenport family. He's their enemy. The words fell like a bomb, destroying whatever remained of the illusion of safety the Davenports had built around Charlotte. Everything she believed to be true was crumbling before her eyes, and the scariest part was that, as much as she wanted to deny it, she knew it was all real. What remained now was a choice: live in ignorance or face the pain of the truth. Thomas stepped back, as if the revelation had left him speechless. He looked at the ground, lost in his own thoughts, while Charlotte felt the weight of what she had just discovered. Every word she had spoken seemed to echo in her mind, creating a labyrinth of conflicting emotions. But there was more, much more. She had learned the name of her biological father, but he wasn't just an ordinary man. He was part of a network of revenge that extended far beyond what she could imagine. What else would she discover? What secrets were still hidden in the shadows of the Davenport mansion? What did Margaret and Henry really know about her true origin? As the days passed, Charlotte began to realize that the truth was far more complex than she could understand. Thomas, for his part, was becoming more distant. What did she expect from him? Support? Understanding? Or perhaps something more? Their feelings were becoming increasingly tangled in a web of confusion and guilt. What should have been a familial relationship was turning into an emotional betrayal. The tension between them erupted in a confrontation. On a rainy night, when the wind howled outside, Charlotte confronted Margaret and Henry, demanding answers. It no longer mattered what would happen next. She needed to know. I know about my father. I know what he did. And I want to know why you never told me the truth, she shouted, her voice filled with anger and pain. Margaret, pale as the moon, looked at her, her eyes teary. Charlotte, it's not as simple as you think. He deceived us. He wanted to destroy our family and used us as pawns in his game. We didn't want you to know this. We wanted to protect you. Henry, who had remained silent until then, finally spoke, his voice deep and tense. It was a mistake, Charlotte. A mistake we made in the past and have carried with us. But you have to understand. Everything we did out of love for you. The final revelation was a punch to the stomach. The pain of the truth was overwhelming. They hadn't adopted her because they loved her. They hadn't taken her in with compassion. She was merely a piece in a game they hadn't chosen to play, but to which they were inextricably linked. Now, Charlotte's choice lay before her, and she knew what she had to do. The forbidden love for Thomas, the lies about her adoption, what should she do with all of it? The weight of the truth fell on Charlotte with an intensity she had never imagined possible. The days following the revelation felt like an immense desert, where every step seemed drier, more painful than the last. The love she felt for Thomas, the bond with the Davenport family, all of it was crumbling, and she no longer knew who she was or what she should do. Every piece of her life seemed to have been built on lies, and now, with the layers of truth peeled away, she found herself exposed, lost, and vulnerable. Margaret and Henry, realizing the impact of her revelation, began to treat her with more caution, as if it were now impossible to repair the damage done. It was no longer about protecting Charlotte from something, but about trying to deal with the weight of guilt that seemed to consume them. The mornings were quieter, the meals shorter, and the conversations more difficult. Charlotte could feel they were trying to fix something that could no longer be fixed, but the truth was already in the air, and nothing could ever be the same again. The pain of knowing she had been used as a pawn in her biological father's revenge weighed heavily on her shoulders. She could no longer look at the house the same way. Every piece of furniture, every painting, every piece of wood seemed to have been bought and placed there as part of a game she never chose to play. What was she to do with the anger and frustration? Should she just walk away from it all, as if it were a story from another book? Or should she dig deeper, uncover more of the lies, and unearth everything necessary to understand why her existence had been manipulated this way? And Thomas, what to do with him? The love she felt for him was undeniable, but now it seemed stained, like a piece of paper dropped on the ground and trampled by rain. What did he represent to her? Was he also a victim? Or had he, like her, made choices that now separated them forever? The fact that they were bound by something deeper than mere bonds of affection and trust troubled them both. The nature of their relationship could no longer be ignored. They were like two magnets, irresistibly drawn together, yet violently pulling apart at the same time. Charlotte knew something needed to be done. They could not continue living in this space of indecision and conflict. But what exactly would that decision be? On a cold night, Charlotte made a decision. It was when Thomas sought her out, his eyes tired and marked by anguish. He always had a calm expression, as if he knew how to deal with everything, but now his voice trembled, his vulnerability exposed. The image of her adopted brother, who once seemed so distant, now made her question everything she had believed. "Charlotte, we need to talk," he said, his voice low. "About everything. About what's happening between us. I know you're scared. I know you're confused, but I am too. I can't bear to see you pushing me away." She looked at him, feeling the weight of it. The words she had feared so much were finally being said. What she felt for Thomas was far beyond what any words could describe. But now, at that moment, she needed to be honest with herself. "Thomas, what's happening between us isn't something I can keep ignoring. I don't know what I feel for you, and I don't know if I can keep feeling it without destroying everything. I love you, but this love," Charlotte paused, swallowing the pain rising in her throat. "This love is impossible." Thomas seemed stunned, as if her words had been a physical blow. He stepped toward her, and Charlotte felt the warmth of his body close to hers. But he stopped, as if fighting with his own feelings. "Are you telling me it's impossible?" he asked, his voice hoarse, his gaze desperate. "Are you telling me that everything we feel isn't worth it?" Charlotte didn't know what to say. She wanted to explain, to find the right words, but nothing seemed capable of translating the chaos she felt inside. The truth was, she knew that what was happening between them could not continue. The story that bound them was too heavy, the circumstances surrounding them too burdensome. What was left for them now was a difficult choice. Before she could say anything, a scream from Margaret echoed through the house, slicing the silence like a sharp blade. Charlotte and Thomas exchanged looks, both frightened. They ran to the living room, where Margaret was, pale and trembling, her eyes wide with fear. "What happened?" Thomas asked, trying to control the panic that was starting to take over him. Margaret could barely breathe. She pointed to the table, where an envelope lay. Charlotte's name was written on it, in firm but hurried handwriting. "It's from your father," Margaret said, her voice trembling. He wants to talk to you." Charlotte felt a chill run down her spine. Her biological father was alive, and now he wanted to meet her? The last thing she had imagined was being confronted with yet another truth. What else did he have to reveal? And more importantly, what would she do with this new discovery? The envelope was sealed, but its contents were about to destroy even more of what she believed to be true. She held the paper, feeling the weight of destiny in her hands. There was more to this story, and Charlotte wasn't sure if she was ready to find out what would come next. But something inside her told her she had no choice. That night, the tension between the three of them was palpable. Charlotte knew the final confrontation was closer than ever. The future was about to unfold before her, and she would have to choose between maintaining loyalty to the family who raised her, despite all the secrets and lies, or following her own truth, even if it meant severing ties with everything she knew. The envelope lay there, before Charlotte, and its contents seemed to weigh more than everything else. She looked at Margaret, then at Thomas. They both seemed so small in that moment, so fragile, as if the shadows of the past had finally reached them all, and the future was an unknown, terrifying vastness. Margaret was in a panic. Her face, usually serene, was marked by lines of anguish, and her hands trembled as she held a cup of now cold tea. Henry, quieter than ever, watched the scene with an expression that reflected the anxiety overtaking the house. The house that, until recently, seemed to be a safe haven for Charlotte, was now becoming a prison of uncertainties. Charlotte looked at the envelope. There was something about it that made her hesitate. Her father's name was there, written in a hard, impersonal script. But it wasn't just that made her hesitate. There was a sense of imminence, as if this moment was the dividing line between before and after. She knew that by opening that envelope, there would be no turning back. The secrets of the past involving her adoption, the betrayal of her own flesh and blood, would finally be revealed. And what would come next? Was she ready for this? With a deep sigh, Charlotte finally broke the seal. Inside, there was a simple letter, written directly, with no attempt to soften the words. She read in silence, absorbing each syllable, each sentence like a poison slowly spreading through her veins. Charlotte, you don't know me. I am the man who made your life what it is today. Everything you believe to be true, all the pain you've carried, it was all part of a plan I devised to destroy the Davenport family. I hate them, every one of them. And you, my daughter, were just another piece in this game. But you're no longer in my hands. There is nothing I want from you, except for you to understand what happened. I am your father, and everything I did was for revenge. The words were clear, emotionless, without remorse. Charlotte felt the ground fall away beneath her feet. The man she had never known, the man who should have been her anchor, was responsible for all her suffering. What more could she expect from this man? She felt a knot in her throat, a tightness in her chest that almost made her collapse. Thomas was by her side, watching her with a dark gaze. They didn't need words. He knew what this meant. They knew the confrontation was near, and their lives would never be the same after that letter. Why didn't you tell me this? Charlotte whispered, looking at Margaret. Why did you hide it from me all this time? Margaret looked like she was about to break down. We didn't know, Charlotte. We didn't know he was capable of something so cruel. When we found out, it was too late. He had already manipulated everything, and at that moment, all we wanted was to protect you. Charlotte felt a mix of anger and compassion for the woman who had raised her. Margaret had been a maternal figure to her, someone who always tried to give her a better life, but in the end, the truth seemed bigger than any gesture of love she could offer. It had all been a farce, a carefully constructed illusion to hide the brutal reality. She looked at Thomas, and the pain in his eyes was like a sharp blade cutting her from the inside. They could no longer deceive themselves. Their relationship, which had been marked by growing affection, was no longer simple. There was a bond between them that transcended sibling love, but that didn't make their love right. It was, at the same time, born of circumstance and pain, and Charlotte knew the truth would destroy them, piece by piece. Suddenly, the sound of a car coming down the road interrupted the silence. Everyone in the room turned. The house felt heavy, as if the air were thick and hard to breathe. Charlotte ran to the window. The car stopped in front of the gates, and a hooded figure quickly descended. Her heart raced. She knew who it was. His presence, although unexpected, had an eerie clarity. The man who had sold her, the man who had manipulated everything. Her biological father was standing there, in front of her. The front door opened before Charlotte could make any decision. He entered, with a firm step, as if the house were his. His eyes, dark and calculating, met Charlotte's. It was a cold gaze, without any trace of regret or emotion, as if he were there just to complete another step in his revenge, without realizing the damage he was leaving behind. "So, you finally figured it out, Charlotte," he said with a small smile, which looked more like a triumphant laugh than one of happiness. "I knew it would come to this." Charlotte froze. The man before her was not the father she had dreamed of. He was the one responsible for all the pain, for all the frustration in her life. Anger erupted from her like a volcano about to erupt. "You destroyed everything, didn't you?" she said, her voice trembling but full of strength. "You destroyed my life. You destroyed my family's life." He just shrugged. "I did what I had to do. Revenge doesn't care who suffers along the way. What matters is the objective." The coldness in his voice made Charlotte want to scream, but she held herself back. The pain now wasn't just about him. It was more alive in her than ever before. The anger, the pain, and the confusion were transforming into a force she never imagined she had. The strength to deal with him, to deal with everything he had done. Thomas was by her side now, and she could feel his presence, his gaze. He knew what that moment meant, but the decision was still not made. What to do with all of this? She still had a chance to turn her life around, but before anything, she needed to confront him, not with hate, but with the truth. "You will no longer control my life," Charlotte said, her voice firm but laden with emotion. "I will expose everything. I will expose you. And when the truth is known, you will see that your revenge was in vain." The man looked at her with a dismissive smile, but deep down, he knew the battle that had just begun wouldn't be easy. The house was in an oppressive silence, as if the entire world was waiting for the decision Charlotte would make. She felt the tension building, a weight hard to bear. It was time to face the truth head on, and with it, the consequences of everything that had happened. The man who had cruelly and manipulatively taken her childhood was standing there, in front of her, with an impassive gaze, as if the destruction he had caused was just another step in a game he controlled. Time seemed to stretch. Each passing second felt like an eternity. Charlotte could smell the aged wood in the air, the house still impeccably decorated, the pictures on the wall like silent witnesses to a life that now seemed fragile and broken. The presence of the man before her, with the cold confidence of someone who had always known what he wanted, made it clear that, deep down, he believed nothing could change. But he was wrong. Charlotte took a deep breath, her eyes fixed on him. She was no longer in that place of doubt and confusion. There was something new in her gaze, something determined. It wasn't just anger, it wasn't just revenge. It was the realization that her story was no longer defined by others. She had the power to write her own ending. "You always thought you controlled everything," Charlotte said, her voice firm and cold. "But you were wrong. I'm no longer your pawn. You will pay for everything you've done, but I will move on." She could no longer stay there. She knew that by exposing her father, everything would change. But what worried her most was Thomas's reaction. The weight of this truth would affect him too. She felt his gaze on her, a mixture of guilt, sadness, and pain. But there was no longer space for what could have been. Their relationship was tainted by the lies and cruelty of the past. "Charlotte, please," he said, almost begging. "Don't do this. Don't leave. I can't live without you." She looked at him, her eyes welling with tears, feeling the weight of his words, but knowing she couldn't give in. The love she felt for Thomas wasn't enough to erase the pain of what he represented now. He was tied to her father, and no matter how much she loved him, the wounds couldn't be healed so easily. "I know, Thomas," she replied softly, her voice still trembling but filled with determination. "But I need to follow my own path. Our love cannot be the foundation of my freedom. I need to be strong for myself. I can't carry this anymore." Thomas looked at her with indescribable pain in his eyes, as if seeing her walk away forever. But he knew, deep down, that she was right. He had always known that the truth had the power to change everything. And now, what was left was the emptiness, the loss. But he also knew that, somewhere inside him, life would go on, even without her. Charlotte turned to her father, who was watching her, calm as ever. But he no longer affected her the same way. He was no longer a monster. He was no longer the man who shaped her life with cruelty. He was just a man who had made terrible choices, and now he would pay for them. He would no longer control her. "I'm going to report you," Charlotte said firmly, her voice carrying a strength she never knew she had. "I'll expose everything, what you did, who you really are, and when the truth comes to light, you won't have power over anyone anymore." He laughed, emotionless, as if her threat were a joke. "You really think you can do that? You don't know what you're doing." But Charlotte wasn't intimidated. She had made her decision. It wasn't just about him, or the lies he had created. It was about her, her life, her freedom. "I know exactly what I'm doing," she replied, looking him in the eyes for the last time. "And now it's time for you to pay for everything." She grabbed the letter, and before walking out the door, she let her final words echo through the house. "I will be who I want to be." The next day brought the storm Charlotte knew was coming. She went to the police, took the letter with her, and began unraveling the web of lies her father had spun. By exposing the truth, she also exposed the fragility of the Davenport family. But she didn't care anymore. The pain she carried now had a purpose. It was a cry for freedom, for justice. And despite the consequences, Charlotte knew she had done the right thing. Margaret and Henry, despite the pain of seeing the truth laid bare, understood what she had done. They had never been so honest with themselves. But now, looking at Charlotte, they saw a woman who had been forged in the flames of lies and betrayal, but who, somehow, came out of them stronger. She would forgive them in time. But her journey didn't end there. As for Thomas, Charlotte knew the decision was made. He wouldn't follow her. He would remain trapped in his own pain, his own guilt, not knowing how to cope with losing her. And although she felt sadness for him, she knew it was for the best for both of them. Their love was destined to be a memory, something that would eventually fade with time. Charlotte set off for a new beginning, for a life where she could finally be who she was, unchained, without the weight of a suffocating past. She found a place to live, far from the old house, far from the ghosts that still lingered. With each passing day, she felt closer to the woman she had always wanted to be. And even with a broken heart, she felt more whole than ever. Charlotte knew her life would be far from easy, but for the first time, she was in control. And that, to her, was worth more than any love, more than any bond she had with the past. She didn't know what the future held, but she was ready to face it. And so, Charlotte freed herself. The end.